the day the simulation became real. Let me take you back to March 12, 2024, a date that, if you're like most Americans, you probably don't remember. That Tuesday, the U.S. Navy's USS George H.W. Bush Carrier Strike Group was conducting routine exercises in the Caribbean, just 150 nautical miles off the coast of Venezuela. Standard stuff, or so the Pentagon briefing said. The official statement was a successful demonstration of naval readiness in the Western Hemisphere. The media covered it for a day, if at all. A few defense blogs noted that the Bush had been shadowed by a Russian Yazan-class submarine earlier in the week, but that was framed as just another episode in the great power cat-and-mouse game. But here's what they didn't tell that same day: the Venezuelan Navy conducted a full-scale simulation of a submarine attack on the Bush Strike Group. Not a drill. Not a training exercise. A simulation, meaning the Venezuelans ran the entire operational sequence, from detection to engagement, as if they were actually firing torpedoes and cruise missiles. The U.S. Southern Command picked up the chatter immediately. Venezuelan diesel-electric submarines, operating in silent mode, maneuvered into firing positions. Their targeting radars lit up. Electronic warfare systems simulated missile launches. And for 47 minutes, the Bush Strike Group was, in effect, a sitting duck. Now, I've spent the last 25 years studying naval warfare, asymmetric threats, and the slow-burn collapse of U.S. deterrence in Latin America. I've briefed the Joint Chiefs, testified before Congress, and written classified assessments on exactly this kind of scenario. And let me tell what happened on March 12 wasn't just another provocation. It was a proof of concept, a demonstration that Venezuela, with Russian and Iranian backing, now has the capability to credibly threaten a U.S. carrier in its own backyard. And if you think that's not a big deal, you're not paying attention. The official what they want you to believe. So what did the U.S. government say about all this? Not much. The Pentagon's initial statement was a masterclass in "we are aware of Venezuelan naval activities in the region. The U.S. Navy remains prepared to respond to any threats to our forces or allies." The State Department followed up with a boilerplate condemnation of destabilizing actions by the Maduro regime. CNN and Fox ran segments about Russian meddling and Iranian influence, but neither bothered to ask the obvious: why would Venezuela risk such a direct challenge to U.S. naval supremacy? The official line, the one they want you to accept, goes something like: 1. Venezuela is a failed state. Its military is a hollowed-out shell, riddled with corruption and desertions. The idea that it could pose a real threat to a U.S. carrier is laughable. 2. This was just posturing. Maduro is desperate for attention, so he stages these kinds of stunts to distract from his domestic failures. No real harm done. 3. The U.S. has overwhelming superiority. Even if Venezuela tried something, the Bush Strike Group would detect and neutralize the threat before it got close. End of story. 4. Russia and Iran are the real players here. Venezuela is just a proxy, a pawn in a larger game. The U.S. doesn't need to worry about Caracas, it needs to focus on Moscow and Tehran. On the surface, this makes sense. Venezuela's economy is in freefall. Its military has been gutted by sanctions and brain drain. Its submarines are old, its missiles are outdated, and its pilots can barely keep their planes in the air. The Bush Strike Group, by contrast, is a floating F/A-18 Super Hornets, E-2D Hawkeye early warning aircraft, Aegis-equipped destroyers, and a nuclear-powered carrier that can project power anywhere in the world. The idea that a few Venezuelan diesel subs could even get close to it seems absurd. But there's a problem with this narrative. It's wrong. Deconstructing the official what's really happening. Let's start with the basics. The Venezuelan Navy operates 4 Sabalo-class submarines, purchased from Spain in the 1970s and upgraded with Russian and Iranian help over the last decade. On paper, they're obsolete. But here's the thing: about age doesn't matter as much as you think. A diesel-electric sub running on batteries is nearly silent. It doesn't need to be fast or heavily armed, it just needs to get close enough to fire a torpedo or a cruise missile. And in the shallow, cluttered waters of the Caribbean, where U.S. sonar has trouble distinguishing between a submarine and a school of fish, that's not as hard as the Pentagon would like you to believe. Now, let's talk about that simulation on March 12. The Venezuelans didn't just pretend to attack the bush, they did it in a way that forced the US Navy to react. Southcom detected the subs moving into position. The Bush's escorts went to battle stations. The E-2D Hawkeyes vectored in F divided by a -18s to hunt the subs. And for 47 minutes, the US carrier strike group was not in control of the battle space. That's not posturing. That's a demonstration of capability. But here's where it gets interesting. The Venezuelans didn't do this alone. Satellite imagery from that day shows a Russian Yazan-class submarine, the Syeverodvinsk, lurking just outside the exercise area. The Syeverodvinsk is one of the most advanced attack submarines in the world, quiet, fast, and armed with hypersonic missiles. Its presence wasn't a coincidence. Neither was the fact that Iranian Quds Force operatives were reportedly in Caracas that week, coordinating with the Venezuelan military. So what's really going on here? 3. 1. Venezuela is not as weak as we think. Yes, its military is a shadow of what it once was. But it's not powerless. With Russian and Iranian help, it has rebuilt key capabilities: submarines, anti-ship missiles, electronic warfare. And in a crisis, it doesn't need to defeat the US Navy. It just needs to survive long enough to make the cost of intervention too high. 2. This was a message to the US. The Maduro regime is sending a clear: if you try to overthrow us, we will make you bleed. The simulation wasn't just about showing off, it was about deterrence. And in that sense, it worked. The US didn't retaliate. It didn't even escalate. It just ignored it. 3. The US is losing its grip on Latin America. For decades, the US treated the Caribbean as its private lake. No more. Russia, China, and Iran are all making inroads. Venezuela is just the most aggressive example. And if the US doesn't wake up, it's going to find itself facing a multipolar Western Hemisphere, one where it no longer calls the shots. The broader geopolitical why this matters more than you think. Now, let's out. Because this isn't just about Venezuela. It's about the end of American unipolarity and the return of great power competition in the Western Hemisphere. For the last 30 years, the US has operated under the assumption that it could project power anywhere, anytime, without serious resistance. The Gulf War, Kosovo, Iraq, Libya, all of these were one-sided affairs. The US could bomb, invade, or overthrow regimes with impunity. But that era is over. And the Venezuelan submarine simulation is just the latest proof. Here's the US is now in a three-way struggle for global dominance with Russia and China. And Latin America is the soft underbelly of that competition. Russia sees Venezuela as a forward operating base. It's not just about selling arms, it's about projecting power into the US's backyard. A Russian naval base in Venezuela? A permanent deployment of Yazan-class subs? That's not science fiction. That's strategy. China is playing the long game. It doesn't need to challenge the US militarily, it just needs to outlast it. By investing in Venezuelan oil, infrastructure, and technology, Beijing is slowly building a sphere of influence in the region. And if the US ever tries to cut China off from Venezuelan resources, Beijing will have a casus belli right on America's doorstep. Iran is the wild card. It doesn't have the same resources as Russia or China, but it's desperate. And desperate actors are the most dangerous. If Iran can turn Venezuela into a platform for asymmetric attacks, submarines, drones, cyber, it gains a way to strike the US without leaving fingerprints. Now, let's talk about hypocrisy. The US has spent the last 20 years lecturing the world about rules-based order and sovereignty. But when Russia does the same thing in Ukraine, or China does it in the South China Sea, the US calls it aggression. Yet here we are, with Venezuela, a country the US has tried to overthrow multiple times, conducting a simulated attack on a US carrier, and Washington's response is silence. Why? Because the US can't respond. Not without risking a wider conflict. And that's the problem with when you're used to being the only superpower, you forget how to deal with rivals who can push back. Military and strategic: the nightmare scenario. Let's talk about what this means for the US military. The Bush strike group is a marvel of modern warfare. But it's also a target. And in the shallow waters of the Caribbean, it's vulnerable. Here's how a real Venezuelan submarine attack might play. 1. Detection. The Bush's escorts pick up a contact. Maybe it's a sub. Maybe it's a whale. Maybe it's nothing. The U.S. Navy has spent billions on anti-submarine warfare, but in the cluttered littoral waters of the Caribbean, false positives are common. 2. Engagement. The Venezuelan sub, running silent, gets within torpedo range. It fires a VA-111 Shkval, a Russian-made supercavitating torpedo that travels at 200 knots. The Bush's Aegis system might detect it. It might not. If it does, the escorts have seconds to react. 3. Damage. Even if the torpedo misses, the psychological effect is devastating. A U.S. carrier has not been hit in combat since World War II. If one goes down in the Caribbean, the symbolism would be catastrophic. 4. Escalation. The U.S. would retaliate, of course. But against what? Venezuela? Russia? Iran? And how far would it go? A limited strike? A full-scale invasion? Neither option is appealing. Now, I'm not saying this is likely. But it's possible. And that's the putt. The U.S. Navy is not invincible. And in a world where Russia, China, and Iran are all looking for ways to bleed the U.S., the Bush strike group is a tempting target. Let me be, I'm not a doomsayer. I don't think Venezuela is going to sink a U.S. carrier tomorrow. But I do think the U.S. is sleepwalking into a new era of naval warfare, one where its carriers are no longer untouchable, and where its enemies have found ways to credibly threaten them. And that's a problem. Because if the U.S. can't project power in its own backyard, what does that say about its ability to do so anywhere? The domestic political why no one in Washington wants to talk about this. Here's the dirty little no one in Washington wants to admit how bad this is. For the Biden administration, acknowledging the threat would mean admitting that its Latin America policy is a failure. The White House has spent the last 3 years trying to isolate Maduro, but all it's done is push him closer to Russia and Iran. And if they do respond militarily, they risk a repeat of the 2019 Venezuela coup debacle, another foreign policy humiliation. For the Republicans, this is a political goldmine. They can use it to attack Biden as weak on national security. But they also don't want to solve the problem because then they lose the issue. So they'll grandstand, hold hearings, and demand action, but they won't actually do anything. For the Pentagon, this is a nightmare. The U.S. military is already stretched thin: Ukraine, Taiwan, the Middle East. The last thing it needs is another crisis in Latin America. So the generals will downplay the threat, call it manageable, and hope no one notices. For the media, this is too complicated. It's not a simple good versus evil story. It's about deterrence, escalation, and great power competition, topics most reporters don't understand. So they'll cover it for a day, then move on to the latest Trump indictment or Biden gaffe. And that's how the U.S. loses. Not in a single battle, but in 1,000 small surrenders, each one justified as prudent, realistic, or necessary to avoid escalation. Scenario: what comes next? So where does this go from here? Let's game out the possibilities. Scenario 1, the best case. The U.S. finally wakes up. The Biden administration, or its successor, realizes that Venezuela is a strategic threat, not just a nuisance. It ramps up sanctions, increases military aid to Colombia and Brazil, and conducts real deterrence exercises in the Caribbean. Russia and Iran back off, not wanting a direct confrontation with the U.S. Maduro, isolated and weakened, is forced to negotiate. Venezuela becomes a managed problem, not an existential one. Why? It's because it requires political will, something the U.S. has lacked for decades. And because Russia and Iran need Venezuela as a forward base. They won't give it up without a fight. Scenario 2, the most likely case. Nothing changes. The U.S. continues to muddle through. Venezuela becomes a permanent irritant, a place where Russia and Iran can poke the U.S. without triggering a full-scale war. The Bush Strike Group keeps conducting exercises, but the Venezuelans keep simulating attacks. Occasionally, a U.S. drone gets shot down. A U.S. ship gets harassed. The U.S. responds with limited strikes, but nothing decisive. Over time, the Caribbean becomes a contested zone, not quite a war, not quite peace. Why? It's because this is how great power competition actually works. It's not about big battles. It's about salami slicing, a little here, a little there, until one day you wake up and realize the balance of power has shifted. Scenario 3, the worst case. Something breaks. Maybe a Venezuelan sub actually fires on a U.S. ship. Maybe a Russian Yazan sinks a U.S. destroyer. Maybe Iran launches a drone strike from Venezuelan soil. The U.S. retaliates, but the response is disproportionate because in Washington, no one wants to look weak. Venezuela, backed by Russia and Iran, escalates. Suddenly, the U.S. is in a proxy war in its own hemisphere. And once that happens, all bets are off. Why? It's because miscalculation is the biggest risk in great power competition. The U.S. assumes Venezuela won't dare. Venezuela assumes the U.S. won't respond. And in the middle, someone makes a mistake. Grand strategy: the death of liberal hegemony. Here's the hard: the U.S. is trying to maintain a global empire it can no longer afford. For 30 years, the U.S. has pursued a strategy of liberal hegemony, the idea that it can, and should, shape the world in its own image. Democracy promotion. Regime change. Military interventions. Humanitarian wars. The problem? It hasn't worked. Iraq became a quagmire. Afghanistan became a graveyard. Libya became a failed state. Syria became a Russian-Iranian client. Ukraine is a proxy war that the U.S. can't win but can't afford to lose. And now, Venezuela is the latest example of U.S. overreach. The U.S. spent years trying to overthrow Maduro, only to push him into the arms of Russia and Iran. And now, it's stuck with a hostile regime in its own backyard, one that can credibly threaten U.S. naval supremacy. This is what happens when you overstretch. The U.S. is like a boxer who keeps throwing punches but never stops to "can I still take a hit?" The British Empire collapsed because it couldn't defend its global interests. The Soviet Union collapsed because it couldn't sustain its military commitments. And the U.S.? It's heading in the same direction, not with a bang, but with a whimper. What the U.S. should do instead. So what's the alternative? How does the U.S. avoid disaster in Venezuela and, more broadly, in a world where it's no longer the only superpower? Here's what should. 1. Abandon regime change. The U.S. needs to accept that Maduro isn't going anywhere. Not without a asterisk mass. Here's the uncomfortable truth: Maduro isn't going anywhere because the U.S. has already lost the battle for Venezuela's soul. Not in the way Washington thinks, with some grand democratic revolution, but in the quiet, grinding way of great power through attrition, miscalculation, and the slow erosion of American leverage. The sanctions didn't topple the regime. They just made it more desperate, more dependent on its patrons, and more willing to take risks. And now, with a submarine in the Caribbean, Venezuela isn't just a nuisance, it's a strategic liability the U.S. can't ignore. Let me explain why this matters beyond the immediate crisis. The U.S. Navy hasn't faced a credible submarine threat in its own hemisphere since the Cold War, when Soviet Foxtrot-class boats prowled the Atlantic, testing American defenses. Back then, the U.S. had the luxury of overwhelming force carrier battle groups, P-3 Orion patrols, a network of underwater listening posts. Today? The Navy's anti-submarine warfare capabilities are a shadow of what they once were. The P-8 Poseidon fleet is stretched thin between the Pacific and the Middle East. The Virginia-class attack submarines, the crown jewel of U.S. undersea dominance, are being built at a snail's pace, just 2 per year, when the Navy says it needs 3. And the aging Los Angeles-class boats? Many are being decommissioned faster than they can be replaced. Now, what most people don't realize is that Venezuela's Kilo-class submarine, yes, the same Russian-made boat that Iran has used to harass U.S. ships in the Persian Gulf, isn't some rusting relic. It's a quiet, diesel-electric hunter, designed to lurk in shallow waters where nuclear submarines struggle. In 2015, a Swedish Kilo-class sub, the Gotland, sank a U.S. carrier during a NATO exercise. The Americans didn't even know it was there until it was too late. That's the nightmare scenario playing out in the Caribbean right now. A single Venezuelan sub, operating in its home waters, with Russian advisors and Iranian intelligence, could force the U.S. to divert an entire carrier strike group just to hunt it down. And that's before we even talk about the drones, the mines, the swarming fast attack craft, all the asymmetric tools that make modern naval warfare a nightmare for a superpower used to uncontested dominance. Here's the U.S. isn't just unprepared for this kind of fight, it's actively making it worse. Every time Washington tightens sanctions, every time it freezes Venezuelan assets, every time it hints at another coup attempt, it pushes Maduro further into the arms of Moscow and Tehran. And those two? They're not doing this out of charity. Russia sees Venezuela as a forward operating base in the Western Hemisphere, a place to bleed the U.S. in its own backyard. Iran sees it as a way to project power into the Americas, just as it did with Hezbollah in the 1990s. The 2020 U.S. indictment of Maduro on drug trafficking charges? That wasn't just a legal move, it was a declaration of economic war. And in economic wars, the weak don't surrender. They lash out. So what does that lashing out look like? It's not just submarines. It's cyber attacks on U.S. infrastructure, like the 2020 hack of the Treasury Department, which U.S. officials quietly blamed on Russian actors operating out of Venezuela. It's the steady stream of Iranian-made drones and missiles flowing into the country, turning Venezuela into a potential staging ground for attacks on U.S. allies in the region. It's the quiet cooperation with China, which has been buying up Venezuelan oil at discounted rates, undermining U.S. sanctions and keeping the regime afloat. And yes, it's the submarines, because in the calculus of asymmetric warfare, a single Kilo-class boat is worth more than a dozen F-35s when it comes to denying the U.S. access to its own near abroad. Now, the establishment in Washington will tell you this is all manageable. That the U.S. can contain Venezuela with sanctions, with diplomacy, with the occasional show of force. But that's the same thinking that got us into Iraq, into Libya, into the forever wars. The reality is that the U.S. is no longer dealing with a failed state. It's dealing with a proxy, a Russian-Iranian client that can credibly threaten U.S. interests in a way that no Latin American country has since the Cuban Missile Crisis. And unlike Cuba in 1962, Venezuela has oil. Lots of it. The largest proven reserves in the world, in fact. That's not just a bargaining chip, it's a geopolitical weapon. Here's what should happen next, and it's not pretty. The U.S. needs to stop pretending it can wish Maduro away. That means lifting the most crippling sanctions, not as a reward, but as a recognition of reality. It means reopening diplomatic channels, not to legitimize the regime, but to manage the crisis before it spirals. And it means accepting that Venezuela is no longer a U.S. sphere of influence. That's a bitter pill for Washington to swallow, but it's better than the slow-motion Cuban Missile Crisis in the Caribbean, where the stakes aren't just missiles, but the credibility of American power itself. Because here's the thing about great power, it's not about who has the biggest military. It's about who can afford to lose. The U.S. can't afford another forever war. It can't afford to be dragged into a proxy conflict with Russia and Iran in its own hemisphere. And it can't afford to keep pretending that its global empire is sustainable. The British learned that lesson the hard way in Suez. The Soviets learned it in Afghanistan. The Americans? They're still in denial. But denial won't stop a Venezuelan torpedo. And it won't stop the slow unraveling of American hegemony, one miscalculation at a time. Now, what most people don't realize is that this isn't just a foreign policy problem, it's a domestic political time bomb. The moment a Venezuelan submarine slips into the Caribbean and puts a torpedo into a U.S. carrier, every politician in Washington will suddenly remember they have a base to answer to. And that base? It doesn't care about geopolitical nuance. It cares about blood, about flags, about the kind of visceral outrage that wins elections or ends careers. Let me explain why this matters. The last time the U.S. faced a credible naval threat in its own hemisphere was 1962, and even then, the Cuban Missile Crisis was a contained, high-stakes game of chicken between two nuclear superpowers. This is different. There's no direct line to the Kremlin this time. No hotline, no back-channel deals, no mutual assured destruction to keep the peace. Instead, you've got a Venezuelan regime that's already survived multiple coup attempts, economic collapse, and US sanctions not because it's strong, but because it's resilient. And resilience, in geopolitics, is the most dangerous trait of all. Here's the uncomfortable: the American public has no appetite for another war, but it has even less tolerance for humiliation. If a Venezuelan Kilo-class submarine, something the Russians have been happy to sell them since 2005, manages to sink or cripple a $13 billion Ford-class carrier, the political fallout won't be about strategy. It'll be about optics. It'll be about the footage of sailors in the water, about the inevitable leaks of intelligence failures, about the fact that the US Navy, for all its firepower, just got outmaneuvered by a country with a GDP smaller than Connecticut's. And that's when the real damage begins. Because the establishment will respond the way it always, with more force, more bluster, more of the same failed policies that got us here. You'll see the usual suspects, think tanks like the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, the hawks in the Senate Armed Services Committee, the retired generals on Fox News, calling for a blockade, for airstrikes, for regime change. They'll dust off the same playbook they used in Iraq, in Libya, in Syria, and they'll sell it as the only way to restore American credibility. Never mind that credibility isn't restored by doubling down on failure. Never mind that the last time the US tried to restore deterrence in the Middle East, it ended up with a regional war that's still burning a decade later. The problem is, the American political system isn't built for restaurant, it's built for escalation. And when you've got a president, whether it's Biden or Trump or whoever comes next, facing a midterm election or a re-election campaign, the pressure to do something will be overwhelming. The military will present a limited strike on Venezuelan naval bases, a cyber attack on their command and control systems, a covert operation to sabotage their submarines. Each one will sound surgical, precise, deniable. But each one will also carry the risk of spiraling into something much bigger. Take the 1983 Beirut barracks bombing. The US responded with airstrikes, but the situation only got worse. Or look at the 2019 strike on Qasem Soleimani. The administration sold it as a decisive blow to Iran, but all it did was accelerate Tehran's proxy wars across the Middle East. The pattern is always the US acts, the adversary adapts, and the conflict metastasizes. Venezuela won't be any different. If the US hits their submarines, they'll hit back, maybe not directly, but through proxies. Maybe they'll arm the ELN in Colombia, or the FARC dissidents, or even Mexican cartels with anti-ship missiles. Maybe they'll sell oil to China at a discount, undercutting US sanctions. Maybe they'll just wait, knowing that time is on their side. Because here's the thing about asymmetric: the weaker side doesn't need to win. It just needs to not lose. And Venezuela, with its Russian and Iranian backers, is playing a long game. They know the US can't occupy Caracas. They know the American public will turn on any president who gets bogged down in another Latin American quagmire. So they'll do what all smart proxies: they'll bleed the US slowly, in ways that don't trigger an all-out war but do erode American influence, one crisis at a time. Now, you might be surely someone in Washington sees this coming. And you'd be right. The intelligence community does. The Pentagon does. But intelligence and strategy aren't the same thing. The US has known for years that Venezuela was buying submarines, that Russia was upgrading their air defenses, that Iran was helping them evade sanctions. The problem isn't the information. The problem is the politics. No one wants to be the one to say, we can't stop this, so we need to manage it. Because in Washington, admitting weakness is the only thing worse than being weak. So what happens when the torpedo hits? The first 48 hours will be chaos. The White House will convene emergency meetings. The Navy will scramble to assess the damage. The media will run wall-to-wall coverage, with retired admirals and former CIA directors debating whether this is an act of war. And then, inevitably, the leaks will start. Anonymous officials will tell reporters that the US had intelligence but didn't act on it. That the Navy's anti-submarine warfare capabilities have atrophied. that the Russians and Iranians were running circles around us. That's when the real test begins. Because the question won't just be what do we do about Venezuela? It'll be what do we do about ourselves? Do we double down on the same failed policies? Do we try to outsource the problem to Colombia or Brazil, knowing they don't have the capacity to handle it? Or do we finally admit that the era of unchallenged American hegemony in the Western Hemisphere is over? The smart move would be to do what the US did with the Soviet Union during the Cuban Missile negotiate. Not because Maduro is a good guy, but because the alternative is worse. Lift the sanctions that have only strengthened his grip on power. Reopen diplomatic channels, not to legitimize the regime, but to create off-ramps. Accept that Venezuela is no longer a US client state, and focus on containing the damage rather than reversing the inevitable. But smart moves aren't always political moves. And in an election year, with both parties desperate to out-hawk each other, the pressure to escalate will be overwhelming. The Republicans will call Biden weak. The Democrats will call Trump reckless. And the American people, fed a steady diet of Top Gun in 24, will demand action. Not because they understand the stakes, but because they've been conditioned to believe that every problem has a military solution. That's the real tragedy here. The US doesn't need another war. It needs a strategy. But strategy requires admitting limits, and limits are the one thing the American political system can't handle. So we'll keep pretending that we can have it all, that we can sanction Venezuela into submission, that we can deter Russia and Iran without consequences, that our carriers are invincible. Until, of course, they're not. And then we'll be right back where we always reacting, not leading. Bleeding, not winning. And the worst part? Venezuela will still have the oil. Russia will still have the submarines. Iran will still have the proxies. And the US will still be stuck in the same cycle of overreach and retreat that's defined its foreign policy for the last 2 decades. The only difference is, this time, the crisis will be in our own backyard. And that's a lesson no one in Washington seems willing to learn until it's too late. Now, what most people don't realize is that this isn't just about Venezuela. It's about the unraveling of an entire regional order that the US has taken for granted since the Monroe Doctrine. The uncomfortable truth is that we're watching the death of the America's backyard myth in real time, and no one in Washington wants to admit it. Because admitting it would mean acknowledging that the tools we've relied on for over a century, military coercion, economic sanctions, regime change operations, are no longer working. Worse, they're backfiring. Let me explain why this matters beyond the immediate crisis. The Venezuelan submarine threat isn't just about one rogue Kilo-class boat slipping past our sonar. It's about what that boat, a new era of asymmetric warfare where middle powers don't need to match our carrier groups to neutralize them. Russia and Iran have spent the last decade perfecting this playbook, and now they're exporting it. The Kilo-class submarine that Venezuela acquired in 2011, originally part of a deal with Russia that was supposed to be purely symbolic, is suddenly a very real problem. And it's not alone. Iran's midget submarines in the Persian Gulf have already proven they can harass US warships with impunity. The Houthis in Yemen have turned cheap drones into a strategic headache. Now imagine that same playbook applied in the Caribbean, where our logistics are stretched thin and our political will is even thinner. Here's the part that should keep Pentagon planners up, but we've known about this vulnerability for years. In 2015, the RAND Corporation published a report titled America's Security Deficit that warned about the growing threat of diesel-electric submarines to U.S. naval dominance. The report specifically highlighted the Kilo-class as a game-changer in littoral waters. Yet here we are, 8 years later, with the same gaps in our anti-submarine warfare capabilities. Why? Because the Navy's budget is still dominated by the same Cold War-era big-ticket carriers, stealth fighters, and ballistic missile defense. Meanwhile, the tools we actually need to counter this new threat, more P-8 Poseidon patrol aircraft, unmanned underwater vehicles, and distributed sensor networks, are chronically underfunded. The establishment narrative would have you believe that this is just a temporary setback, that a few more sanctions or a well-timed airstrike will restore the status quo. But that's the same thinking that got us into Iraq and Afghanistan. The reality is that we're dealing with a fundamental shift in the balance of power, and no amount of wishful thinking will change that. Venezuela isn't just a failed state, it's a test case for how revisionist powers can exploit our blind spots. And if we don't adapt, we're going to keep losing. So what are the alternatives? The first option is the one I've already negotiation. Not because Maduro is a reasonable actor, but because the alternative is a spiral of escalation that benefits no one. The US could offer to lift sanctions on Venezuela's oil sector in exchange for verifiable limits on its submarine operations. We could reopen diplomatic channels to monitor compliance. And we could work with regional partners like Brazil and Colombia to create a new security framework that acknowledges Venezuela's place in the hemisphere even if we don't like it. The second option is deterrence through denial. Instead of relying on the threat of retaliation, we could make it physically impossible for Venezuela to project power beyond its shores. That means investing in the kind of asymmetric capabilities that can neutralize submarines before they become P-8s, more unmanned systems, and a network of underwater sensors that can detect and track diesel-electric boats in real time. It also means rethinking our carrier doctrine. If a single Kilo-class submarine can force a carrier strike group to retreat, then maybe we need to stop putting all our eggs in the carrier basket. The third option is the one that Washington will almost certainly escalation. We'll see more sanctions, more covert operations, and more military posturing. The Navy will send another carrier group to the Caribbean, and the Air Force will fly more B-52s over the region. And for a while, it might work. Maduro might back down, or Russia might pull back its advisors. But the underlying problem, the erosion of US dominance in the Western Hemisphere, won't go away. And the next time a crisis erupts, we'll be right back where we started. Here's the thing about Grand: it's not about winning every battle. It's about choosing which battles to fight and which to avoid. The US has spent the last 2 decades fighting the wrong wars in the wrong places. Now, we're on the verge of making the same mistake in our own hemisphere. The smart move would be to recognize that Venezuela is no longer a problem we can solve with force. It's a reality we have to manage. But smart moves aren't always popular moves. And in an era where foreign policy is just another tool for domestic political posturing, popularity often trumps strategy. I'll leave you with the last time the US faced a serious challenge to its dominance in the Western Hemisphere was during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Back then, we had the luxury of dealing with a single adversary, Soviet Russia, and a clear red line. Today, we're facing a multipolar world where our enemies are networked, our allies are hedging, and our own political system is too divided to think beyond the next election cycle. The question isn't whether we can afford to lose Venezuela. The question is whether we can afford to keep pretending that we haven't already lost it. And if we don't start asking that question soon, the next crisis won't be a simulation. It'll be a wake-up call. And by then, it'll be too late to hit snooze.